So I wanted to say just a few words. I'm delighted on behalf of McCarthy Tétrault to welcome all of you here today. We had an opportunity to speak a few years ago about AI regulation and AI policy, and I think it's particularly relevant that we've decided now to focus on responsible AI use in the aerospace industry. Many of the speakers who have already introduced this conference have mentioned this sort of the concept of shared values between Germany and Canada, and I think that too is a theme that I will sort of reinforce in my comments. I think it's very interesting that Canada is about to potentially adopt an AI and Data Act that is very much outlined and inspired by the EU AI Act that's also quickly moving forward. And so what I wanted to do today was to cover the following topics. AI policy framework so to talk briefly about the AI policy framework that's coming into focus, to talk about how we've moved past the policy into actual AI law, to discuss a few use cases and issues of concern for the aerospace industry, and then finally to discuss AI governance implications from the regulatory framework. So the first slide I want to present on screen is a very busy slide, but what it does is it summarizes what you're looking at is a Harvard University study that took a look at policy frameworks that were being developed both in the private sector and government and non-NGO civil society for the responsible deployment of artificial intelligence. And what this slide shows is that despite the 40 different frameworks that were reviewed, each of them ultimately focused on a set of core themes that I'll present on the screen now. The first is that AI its usage in industry and society should be human-centered and be concerned about its ethical purpose and societal benefit. So thinking about not just what is possible with AI, but should we really be deploying it for these use cases? And in the aerospace industry, one of the areas of concern is lethal autonomous weapon systems. We think about drones that we're seeing used a lot in military context. That's one area of concern. Accountability. Who is responsible ultimately for this deployment? And are humans in the loop when AI systems are being deployed? Fairness and non-discrimination. A lot of concerns that AI could simply reinforce biases that are found in the data sets that have been used to train the systems, and if there isn't concrete measures taken, that these biases will simply be reinforced and amplified by AI systems. Transparency and explainability. A lot of concerns about the black box. How is it possible? We just don't understand how these systems work and where these systems are being used to make decisions that affect people's lives. The importance of being able to, first of all, be transparent about the fact that you're using an AI system, and chatbots have become so convincing in their responses that sometimes people think they're interacting with humans. But also, how has the outcome been achieved? And so, is it possible? And how can you explain the key parameters that led to a decision that's been taken? Privacy and security, and I'll focus on the security aspect here, particularly in the aerospace industry. Obviously, cybersecurity is a major concern, but in general, AI is being used in ways to control autonomously the airplanes and other aeronautic devices. And so security is absolutely key. And then reliability. Does it work? Everyone has seen how generative AI can hallucinate. And we certainly don't want AI-powered systems that are powering our airplanes to hallucinate midstream. So those themes are policy themes that in fact have been reflected in just about every single regulatory framework that's being contemplated around the world. And we've moved very quickly from policy in record time to regulatory frameworks that are taking place. And the Europeans have led the way, as the Europeans often do in matters of regulation. There's the comment is that the Americans lead the way in innovation and litigation, and the Europeans lead the way in regulation. In other words, using this to helping to ensure that these technologies will be used responsibly. And the EU model involves putting in place a legislative risk pyramid in which some uses are considered to be absolutely unacceptable and therefore should be prohibited. Other uses are high risk uses that need to be subject to quite significant regulation. And then as you move down the scale, there are lower and lower risks that should be subject to lesser and lesser regulation. And the same approach has been adopted in Canada under the proposed AI and Data Act. The concept of high-risk system is referred to as high-impact system in Canada. But I just wanted to flag that within the contemplated categories of high-risk and high-impact systems, there are absolutely categories that will have an impact or potentially have an impact on the aviation sector. As a matter of fact, AI systems that are used in products under EU's product safety legislation, including in aviation, are expressly called out as being areas of high risk. But I think it's also important to note that there are other categories that could touch on AI systems in the sector. AI systems that are used for biometric identification, or for the management and operation of critical infrastructure, and employment and worker management. I think it's important that just about every company may well be using AI systems to hire as part of the hiring decision, and managing or monitoring their employees in the workspace. And those areas as well, that even if your product is not subject to regulation, the use in the employment relationship could well be subject to regulation. Sorry, my computer is... Let me then just provide some concluding remarks. That both in Canada and in Europe, regulatory authorities have decided that it's absolutely essential to regulate AI, and they are proposing regulatory frameworks that, in the event of non-compliance, could result in fines of up to $25 million Canadian, or 5% of worldwide revenue. In Europe, up to 30 million euro, or 6% of total worldwide annual turnover. But putting aside the regulatory framework, which even if adopted later this year, is anticipated, may not come into play and into force for a couple of years, it's absolutely critical that companies that are deploying AI systems think now about how to, thank you, about how to address the risks. So we can move to the next slide. Because the deployment of these systems raises just business risks and reputational risks, and the possibility, particularly in the aerospace sector, of actual harm. I mean, in other words, a lot of people could be very hurt if the systems are not functioning appropriately. And that's why the regulatory frameworks provide for a whole series of governance obligations for high-risk systems. In the EU, the core is about risk management, and so in order to ensure that the systems are functioning as they're intended, the EU imposes obligations on data and data governance, In other words, how models are being trained and ensuring that they are trained through a rigorous process that involves validation and testing of their data sets to ensure that they meet specified quality criteria. Many obligations to maintain technical documentation that may well have to be provided to regulatory authorities. Understanding the technical data through the life cycle by ensuring that there's automatic recording of logs and of events, and making sure that the systems are designed and developed so that their operation is transparent and so that users can understand the systems appropriately and be effectively overseen by natural persons, ensuring that humans are always in the loop. As I have mentioned earlier, the issue of generative AI has been an area of specific controversy and complexity for European regulators, because the initial regime involved a four-part system of regulatory analysis that was based on use case. But with generative AI, these are examples of general purpose AI systems that can be used for multiple purposes. And so regulatory authorities are working hard to find a manner to integrate general purpose AI regulation into the existing structure. And I put on screen similar provisions of regulatory governance obligations under the Canadian AI and Data Act. I won't go through those now, but you'll see many echoes of the European regime. Next slide. So very quickly, I wanted to cite a number of AI use cases in the aeronautics sector. The Canadian government a few years ago made a very significant investment in fundamental research and applied research in the AI sector, in particular in Montreal through the Scale AI initiative, which looked at AI in the supply chain context, and supply chain absolutely in the aeronautics field. We've seen a number of very promising uses of AI already, and there are several examples shown on the screen. AI used for air traffic management, for increasing efficiencies in aerospace engineering, fuel efficiency, which is a very big concern as climate change and the climate crisis is an area of considerable concern around the world. Quality control and maintenance, assembly line automation. Next slide. Supply chain automation. And as will be discussed later today, object detection in outer space and AI autonomy in aerospace. So I won't go through each of these examples, but they're absolutely live, and we have very promising research that has now been applied and developed to develop actual solutions for each of these. So next slide. What are the issues of concern? Well, I flagged for the aerospace industry, I've flagged already a few of them. Data security and the security of the aeronautics vehicles that are implementing the AI in their systems, regulatory compliance, and that I've already mentioned. And automated decision making. Is there AI algorithms depend on high quality and relevant data for the accurate decision making, and when companies have inadequate or biased data, they get flawed and incorrect decisions. So these areas can lead to dangerous concerns, and it's why that the humans must always be in the loop. Workforce impact, I think it's always in any industry important to think through the potential disruptive impact of AI for industry players. The World Economic Forum suggests that 23% of all jobs will change due to AI, and there may be redundancies. So thinking about the human impact of increased efficiency will be important for all members of the industry. Next slide, please. So the governance implications. Responsible AI governance starts at the top, and it's a question of tone at the top. We are helping our clients implement AI governance committees, develop AI policies for their responsible deployment. In particular, since generative AI tools such as ChatGPT have become worldwide phenomenon, you can't have a situation where there's no line of sight as to how these technologies that are so powerful are being deployed by your employees. Very significant concerns about IP rights, about privacy, about the potential loss of confidential information if these systems are used in ways that are not controlled. And therefore, having a policy about how the AI can be used by your organization and ensuring that you remain accountable for its uses in all instances. And accountability in many cases will start with a responsible AI impact assessment. Whenever companies are acquiring technology, often they don't develop it internally, they acquire it from third parties. Thinking through the risks in a very broad sense and how to mitigate those risks in advance. I know that many of you are familiar with privacy impact assessments or data protection impact assessments. The same concept can be leveraged but expanded dramatically to address the risks of AI deployment. Finally, I would mention vendor management is just such a critical role. There's a whole range of contractual issues that come to the fore that are new. And so your standard contracting terms and procurement methods may not be sufficient to address the needs and risks that are inherent in vendors that are proposing AI solutions for you. Next slide. I would mention very quickly, the good news is that there are international standards that are being developed and deployed on risk management for AI. And so I point to NIST and next slide, the ISO 42001 draft standard that is soon to be published. All of them take a very similar approach, and it's absolutely critical that we have harmonization through both the regulatory environment and through international standards, because especially in the aerospace industry, if you're acting in the aerospace industry, you're acting on an international basis, and standards for good governance have therefore been developed and are particularly relevant. Next slide. I mentioned AI vendor management. I think it's particularly complex to contract these days with AI vendors and members through the supply chain. For one thing, you're contracting in an uncertain regulatory environment. The regulatory frameworks are starting to come into play, but none of them have yet been adopted. And so it's important that your contracting account for the fact that new rules may apply to your contractual relationship, and therefore it requires flexibility and adaptability in the contracting approach. Regulatory requirements around transparency and explainability will require vendor support. So it'll be essential that you include terms that require your vendors and providers to provide the applicable disclosures, to provide detailed technical information and operating manuals, and cooperate on responding to requests for greater details in terms of how does this system work and how are the decisions made. Vendors will all want to use your client data to train their models. And that raises confidentiality risks, issues around trade secret control, privacy concerns, data security concerns, and that means that data anonymization will take on a particularly important role in allowing vendors to use anonymized data in some cases to train their models, but not raw data. As I mentioned, high impact systems will require specific measures for risk mitigation and record keeping. All of those obligations will have to be flowed through to your vendors. And we're in a space where high liability exposure is in play, and so there'll be heavy negotiation of limitation of liability clauses. Next slide. So the takeaways, AI-specific regulation is on its way in EU and Canada, and even the United States. We're moving beyond privacy and policy to AI law. Fines for non-compliance are likely to be very material, up to 30 million euro or 6% of worldwide turnover. Very important for Canadian companies to watch developments in the EU and the US to get a clear sense of what's coming. Litigation is already here. So I think it's important to watch what's going on in the United States in particular in terms of the outcomes that we're seeing. And it's absolutely critical that companies that are developing or deploying AI systems must start today to consider the implementation of responsible AI by design. We can't wait until the regulation takes effect because you will be far too long in your investments. You'll have made far too many investments that may have to be unwound if they haven't been properly implemented. So start with an AI governance committee, introduce AI policies, AI impact assessments, and AI vendor management. Thank you.
Thank you.